Espionage Act of 1917 was part of Wilson's array of legislation that included regulating enemy aliens, drafting men for the Army, but the most memorable provisions of the Espionage Act regulated anti-war speech and made it a federal offense to say or do or publish things that would interfere with the war effort, with terms of punishment from 10 to even 20 years eventually, as the Espionage Act is augmented in 1918 with the Sedition Act. World War I was a deeply unpopular war for a significant segment of the American population, and although people didn't fill the streets in protest as they would during Vietnam, they continued to speak out, not necessarily against the war itself, but certainly against particular policies about how the war was being funded, how the troops were being raised through the draft. And coming at a time when there's also a significant radical presence in America in socialist and anarchist movements, many of these people really find themselves in the crosshairs of investigation. A lot of that is coming from the federal government. The FBI triples in size during this time period to enforce these new federal regulations. At one point, the FBI is hiring 50 new agents a week during the war to do this work. And people are getting arrested for things that would surprise us to hear about today. For example, in World War I, people were encouraged to knit socks for soldiers. And one man in Minnesota had sort of refused to do this, and he said, soldiers will never see those socks. It's really, this is just being done to keep people busy at home. And he was actually found guilty under Minnesota's sedition statute for those statements. In Montana, a guy named Vess Hall called Woodrow Wilson a tool of Wall Street, and because of that, he found himself arrested under the Espionage Act. He was actually convicted, but his conviction was overturned. And that so upset a lot of Americans, particularly in the Justice Department, that they pushed for an even stronger law. And so the Espionage Act was augmented in 1918 with the Sedition Act. Eugene Debs was one of America's most outspoken social critics through the 1910s. And he had opposed the war, he opposed conscription, and he continued to speak out over the course of the war and was much criticized, but it was not until September 1918, almost at the end of the war, after a speech in Canton, Ohio, against the draft primarily, when Eugene V. Debs was arrested. He was tried under the Espionage and Sedition Acts. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And he was in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta in 1920 when he was the Socialist Party's candidate on their ticket. And he drew a significant number of votes, but I'm not sure he ever even got to vote for himself.